You know what you're listening to?
Is that a trick question?
It's the I Still Love This Game podcast with your host, Matthew Damian.
He's an idiot. Don't listen to this. He's an idiot.
Hello and welcome to episode 66 of the I Still Love This Game podcast. We have two game threes of the conference finals to talk about. So let's begin obviously with the Rockets and Warriors. And what a disappointing contest this was. The Rockets fell into the exact same trap in Game 3 as they did in Game 1. It's obvious that they don't have room for too much variation in their offense, so they're stuck with isolation plays. Now you might be thinking, hold on a second, they were running ISO almost exclusively in Game 2 and it was quite successful for them. So what happened? Well, firstly, they had ball movement off the ball and they had controlled the glass much better in Game 2. The other thing is they got into their offense much quicker. They didn't hesitate at all. In Game 1, they over-dribbled, and when you combine that with virtually nothing happening off the ball, the Warriors' defense just zoned in on the ball handler. The disappointing thing about Game 3 is this is the exact same problem Houston ran into in Game 1, and they appeared to have corrected in Game 2. So either they let their guard down, or Golden State simply imposed their will. Regardless, and this is what I love about playoff basketball. I know I almost say this every single time in every episode, but when you think about it, you look at the matchups, you look at the strategies and everything like that, but something as simple as how quickly a team will get into their offense will determine the outcome of that game, or whether it's a blowout or even competitive. So we're not talking about one or two possession, we're talking about 30, 40 point differentials, or differences I should say, not differentials. It's incredible to think that something that small makes such a big impact. Now, as I said before, it's obvious that Houston doesn't have a lot of variation to their offense. They have Harden, Paul, and to a lesser extent Gordon, who can score and create. Then they have Ariza, Tucker, Ryan Anderson, Gerald Green, Joe Johnson as well, if you really want to go down the bench. And they're there just for shooting. The only guy that they have that mixes it up on offense for them is Capella. And what I'd like to see is, instead of a screen and roll, which they looked for lobs with Capella, which is really hard for them to actually get going in this series because of the length of Iguodala and Durant and Draymond Green, obviously. I'd like to see them, instead of rolling him to the basket, roll him to the block and get him down on the block, because in those screening situations, either you're going to get a switch, right, and so the big man will have to go on either Chris Paul or James Harden or Eric Gordon, and that's a huge mismatch usually. And if that switch happens, then whoever was guarding the ball handler now has to guard Capella. So instead of just throwing it up to the bucket and letting Capella finish, which he's not able to do because, as I said, the help defense, because they're zoning in, is shutting that down or making that difficult, have him cut directly to the block. And then you have, from the weak side, a perimeter guy stepping up a little bit, coming up more like foul line extension rather than baseline. And then pass it out to him, and then an entry pass into the block, and you should have a major mismatch with Capella posting up the guard that had to switch. I'd like to see that. I don't want that being their number one offensive play, but I would like to see that happen a little bit more. We haven't even seen it at all. And I think this is something that New Orleans probably should have explored, because they had a much bigger offensive threat in Anthony Davis, but they never really tried that. So I'd like to see them try that, and then you would force... It's just something different, because, as I said before, they cannot just rely on ISO. It's because you just need some kind of variation, because otherwise it's a recipe for disaster. Now, the other thing that people are talking about, obviously, is the second half performance of Steph Curry. And we saw his offensive game come back to life. And this is a very dangerous situation for the Rockets, as that now they're dealing with Durant, who has been dominating offensively throughout the entire playoffs. And now if Curry starts to get going, the Rockets' offense will have to be at its best to stay competitive. There's not a whole lot they can do defensively if Durant is dominating. Curry is also just freewheeling out there on offense and just creating all kinds of havoc in pick and roll situations and even in isolation situations, all working off the ball. And then you got Klay Thompson, whatever he gives you in that situation, it's just pure gravy at that point, because you got two. See, here's the scary thing. When it's all said and done with these guys' careers, barring major injuries, Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, I mean, they're close to it already, but I will be shocked when their careers are over, if they are not in the top 15 or top 10 all-time offensive players, right? Obviously, Steph Curry is not a great defensive player. Kevin Durant has definitely not lived up to what he could be defensively throughout his career, although he has improved over the past season in that area. But when you have two players, I mean, it's very rare that you have two players that good offensively on the same team. You can talk about Shaq and Kobe maybe, but Kobe was excellent defensively, and Shaq wasn't a slouch during that period either. You can talk about his inefficiencies in pick and roll situations all you want, but he was still protecting the rim pretty well. And they had enough defenders in Rick Fox, Derek Fisher, Tyronn Lue, people forget about him, and of course Kobe Bryant, that it wasn't that big of an issue. So the point is, I cannot think of maybe a duo better in terms of scoring the ball in their primes than Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. Now, they haven't really meshed all that well, which is kind of interesting for me to bring out and say, because they did win a championship. They did go 16-1 in last year's playoffs. They seem to be on track to getting another, or at least getting back to the finals. But they never really clicked, is what I'm saying. And now we're seeing the potential of them maybe clicking, and that's a real scary proposition if you're an opposing fan, because how do you stop them? They've had troubles. Houston has had troubles, and the rest of the league has had troubles just slowing down Durant in the playoffs so far. Now, if you throw Steph Curry in there, then yeah, you've got real headaches. But let's not overreact to one very, very good half of basketball from one player. He hasn't really shown a whole lot. He hasn't played a whole lot either, but he hasn't shown a whole lot in the playoffs so far. He's been very inconsistent. He's been very inconsistent in this. Well, I shouldn't say he's been very inconsistent in this series. He's been terrible in this series, and he started this game off terribly as well. So it's just something to keep in mind going forward, that we may see a whole new level of offensive brilliance from Golden State over the next couple of games. It's possible. Now, speaking of what we're going to see over the next few games, the question that I started thinking about when I was watching this game, because it was so boring, my mind started wandering, is Game 4 a must-win for the Rockets? And to be honest, I don't know. And if it's not, it's as close to one as you can possibly get. And the only reason I'm hesitant to not call it one is Golden State is so reliant on their starters. And they're being tested on both ends, even though this was a blowout. They are being tested on both ends. They're being pushed on both ends. And we've seen them fall flat on their faces before in long series. So a 3-1 series lead, which they are infamously synonymous with, but if that's not a sure thing, and if they lose Game 5, could we see, of course, I'm saying if they win Game 4 and then they lose Game 5, so it's a 3-2 situation, could we see them wearing down in Game 6 at home? And yeah, I could. So that's why I'm not calling it a must-win. But I wouldn't put money on it either. But it's not as dire straits as it sounds if they do go down 3-1. I still think they've got a decent chance of winning. All they got to do is win back their home court advantage. It's only one game. Now, if they were down 2 games in terms of the home court advantage, and they had to win 2 games in Oracle, then yeah, I'd be really, really concerned about them. But they're only down 1 game in that aspect. So it's not as bad as it sounds. Now, what is as bad as it sounds was Game 3 between the Cavs and Celtics. And there's really not too much to say about this game. I'm glad that Cleveland got back into the series, but this wasn't a contest. The only thing I found interesting was LeBron being willing to allow George Hill to bring the ball up and run the offense at times. this did allow LeBron to set screens and attack from different areas. He would screen away from the ball and then flash up to the top of the key, and then he'd get the ball, and the defense wasn't totally set, and he was able to attack. So that's a positive, because it's a different look. Apart from that, though, Boston was challenged with a new intensity level, and they failed. Normally, with their youth, I'd be very worried about their ability to bounce back from that, because they looked lost out there. But their coach is second to none. He may not win Coach of the Year, but there is not a better coach in basketball right now. And I'm not excluding anybody from that list. But there is no better coach in basketball than Brad Stevens. That being said, I do not expect Boston to win Game 4, but they should be more competitive. I mean, you can take that to the bank. That's not saying a whole lot either. But we should see at least a contest for certain periods of the game. But I think the Cavs will tie the series up, and we're going to have a long series here. Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say we were going to have a situation where the home team wins every game, because I still think Cleveland's going to win this series. But Boston is growing up in front of our eyes. And a part of growing up is dealing with pressure and failure as well. And I think this is just a part of that process, for lack of a better term. Let's move across to some questions. And the first question is, it says, you often talk about Harden and Paul having playoff demons. Who has a worse playoff legacy right now? I would say Chris Paul, and that's that's really not defending James Harden. I mean, you look at Chris Paul; he's had multiple 2-0 series leads, one against the Spurs, one against Memphis that he blew. Obviously a 3-1 series lead as well against Harden and the Rockets, and the comeback by Harden and the Rockets really wasn't Harden and the Rockets. They closed it out in Game 7, but if you think back to that Game 6, it was the 2015 conference semifinals. And this is after we thought, well, Chris Paul's turned the corner because of the way that he played against San Antonio, the defending champion San Antonio, in the first round. But then they were up by, 15, 20 points. It looked like another blowout in LA. And without James Harden on the court, we're talking about Josh Smith and Corey Brewer and players like that led the charge, and Dwight Howard was on the court at the same time. And it was just an insane turnaround, because it wasn't even just that game. If you remember that series, they very nearly won both. I'm talking about the Clippers. They very nearly won both games in Houston to start that series, and that's with Chris Paul. I don't think Chris Paul played either of those two games. I know they very nearly won Game 1, and that was with Austin Rivers starting at point guard. And they won Game 2, obviously. I can't remember if Chris Paul played in Game 2 or not. I know he didn't play in Game 1. But in Game 2, they won. And then Games 3 and 4, it wasn't even close. These were hellacious blowouts. That could have so easily been a sweep for the Clippers. Regardless, they were up 3-1, and Houston was not competitive at all. They did manage to win Game 5, but it looked too little too late. And then in Game 6, it was a rinse and repeat of Games 3 and Games 4, where you saw massive leads being built up. And then out of nowhere, one of the biggest chokes in NBA history occurred. And it was one of those just shocking things. I remember I had just started. It wasn't even a podcast. It was just an Instagram page. I had just started. I couldn't believe what I was watching. It was one of those things that I remember being in front of my phone, because I was using Instagram. I wasn't even using the computer for this. So I had to use the phone. I remember trying to type it. I couldn't put it into words. It was just one of those alarming things that I saw. And the point that I'm trying to make is we've seen some pretty bad performances from James Harden in the playoffs before. Nothing that bad. Nothing. When you look at who was on the team, on the floor, that mounted that comeback against the Clippers, that's what makes it even worse. And then, so you look at James Harden, he had a bad performance in the NBA Finals. He was a bench player, but truly he was a very important piece of the Oklahoma City Thunder. He was a big reason they got to the finals. If you think back to the series against the Spurs, him and Ibaka had great games. I think it was Game 4, or it might have been Game 5. I can't remember. But there was one game in there that they just took over down the stretch. I remember Harden hitting a huge three with the shot clock running down in San Antonio. I think it would have been Game 5 actually, because the Spurs had home court advantage in that series. When you take that into account, you take into account that James Harden has not just been to the NBA Finals, because you might say, well, hold on a second, he was coming off the bench, so you're really going to use that? If Chris Paul was coming off the bench with that Oklahoma team, they would have made the finals. Well, okay, you look at James Harden getting to the conference finals by beating Chris Paul in 2015. So by that extension, him being the quote-unquote man, going up against Chris Paul being the man, it's not like Chris Paul was by himself either. When you look at the talent that he had around him, Chris Paul had more talent around him than what James Harden did. And you might say Dwight Howard, I'll say Blake Griffin. And I still easily say Blake Griffin over Dwight Howard. So the point I'm trying to make is, look, they both had terrible playoff careers, underachieving in big games and big moments. But Chris Paul has had really one of the most disappointing playoff careers of all time. If not the most disappointing playoff career of all time. I do not say that lightly. Next question is, who is my Mount Rushmore of NBA defenders? Now that's a good question. That had me thinking for a long time when I came across that. And I've never been asked that before. I've been asked who I think who my Mount Rushmore is of players and of coaches, but not defenders. So obviously, without any doubt, Bill Russell has to be up there. If anyone questions that, they don't know basketball. I've got Dennis Rodman as he was a number 2 selection, even though I'm not ranking them, but he was the second guy that was able to choose without too many concerns. And you might be thinking, hold on a second, he's more of a rebounder, he's no more as a rebounder. And that might be true. He may have been a better rebounder, but he was one of the greatest rebounders of all time too. So just because he was a better rebounder does not mean he doesn't deserve a spot on this list. The reason I put him on this list is very simple. He guarded Magic Johnson in his prime in the NBA Finals. He guarded Michael Jordan in the conference finals when Jordan was at least in his athletic prime. He guarded Larry Bird in the conference finals when he was around his prime. Guarded Karl Malone in the NBA Finals. And he guarded Shaq, although Shaq wasn't in his prime, but Shaq, from an athletic standpoint, he probably was. And Shaq really never developed a whole lot of offensive skills, so there wasn't much of a difference. There was a difference, but there wasn't much of a difference between Shaq in 96 to Shaq in his prime. The point I'm making, these were all, and that was in the conference finals as well. Those were all high stakes situations. The conference finals and the NBA finals is the highest intensity that you'll come across in basketball. And you can make an argument for all those guys that were either at their prime or close to their prime, and they are the best in their positions. Magic Johnson, the greatest point guard of all time. Jordan, easily the greatest shooting guard of all time. Larry Bird, quite arguably the greatest small forward of all time. Karl Malone, that's not really an argument anymore, but at the time, in 98, he was considered the greatest power forward of all time. And Shaq is up there, at least in consideration, as being one of the greatest centers of all time. And Rodman didn't just guard them, he slowed them down. So for a player to have that kind of defensive versatility is unprecedented, and that includes Bill Russell. So to me, there's no question he's on this list. The next one is Hakeem Olajuwon. He's truly a power forward at a time when positions really did matter, but he was playing center. And he was the all-time blocks leader in the NBA. He racked up a lot of steals as well. The only player in NBA history to be the MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, and Finals MVP in the same year. Not even Jordan did that one. And I think the great thing that I liked about him was just his pure toughness. It didn't matter if he's like Rodman in many ways, but he was a shot blocker. His ability to chase down guards on fast breaks and get blocks, or he could stand in there and take punishment from David Robinson or Patrick Ewing or Shaq, and he would still strip the ball or he'd block their shot. He's a great rebounder. There's not a whole lot of holes in his game. The only guy he really had trouble with was Karl Malone in '97, and by that time his body was starting to wear down a little bit. And of course, it didn't help that he was trying to cover for Matt Maloney either, because Matt Maloney was trying to guard Stockton. So the pick and roll was Stockton and Malone. He didn't have Kenny Smith. He didn't have Sam Cassell slowing down to help out in those situations. So he was trying to cover John Stockton and then get back to Karl Malone, and Karl Malone was tearing him up because of that. He was way out of position. So yeah, came number 3. Number 4 was the fourth spot, not number 4, but the fourth spot was real difficult for me. There's quite a few candidates. Gary Payton, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen. There's, even, and then you want to go down maybe a Ron Artest, maybe a Bruce Bowen. There's Alvin Robinson. There's a lot of players. Dennis Johnson, Michael Cooper, if you wanted to. But I went with Ben Wallace. And Ben Wallace, it's very rare that you'll see a team, in fact, there's only one other player I can think of where a team was actually built, a championship team was built around a defensive player and a defensive player's abilities, and that's Bill Russell. We very nearly saw it in 2009 with Dwight Howard, but they fell short to the Lakers. So Ben Wallace is one of 2 in that. Ben Wallace's job on Shaq was legendary. It really opened my eyes as to how important a quality defender can really stifle a big man, a dominant. Shaq, what was so impressive about that was Shaq had torn up the league so much from 2000 to 2002. 2003, he was injured for a lot of the season. That's when Kobe really emerged as a guy that can carry an offense consistently and put up huge numbers. 2004, Shaq, along with, Karl Malone, who was injured. Gary Payton never fit into the triangle. Kobe Bryant was going through his stuff at Colorado. But Shaq still got them to the NBA Finals. And then he ran into Ben Wallace, and Ben Wallace contained him so well. It was a thing of beauty. So I had to go with him. And people think that I'm, this Jordan apologist or I'm in love with Jordan. No, he doesn't get it over Ben Wallace. Absolutely not. Speaking of Jordan, what are the defining games for Jordan and Kobe? This is a question in regards to me posting a video on YouTube where LeBron developed his clutch gene, and I said that LeBron's clutch gene was really Game 4 against the Indiana Pacers in the 2012 conference semifinals. So the defining games for Jordan and Kobe. Jordan, I've got his 63-point game against Boston. And the reason for that is I don't think Jordan really knew how good he was until that game. I know the basketball world didn't know how good. They'd seen the talent. They saw him as a rookie, what he was able to do. But let me just apply some context as to how good of a game this was. So they saw the talent, they saw the athleticism, the complete skill set. People said he couldn't shoot when he came into the NBA. That's a load of nonsense. His ability to shoot is what allowed him to get to the rim. If he couldn't shoot, they would just give him the Rajon Rondo treatment, right? So he was a good shooter. He was a good passer. He averaged 6 assists a game in his rookie season. He was a complete package. But then he got injured in the second season. We all know about the broken foot. Missed 60-something games. Came back off the bench, if you can believe that, under a minute restriction. And then in the Bulls barely made the playoffs. I think it was like 30 or 32 wins or something like that they made the playoffs. One of the lowest win totals to ever make the playoffs in NBA history. And they went up against the Celtics, one of the greatest teams of all time. They had only dropped one game at home, and that was to Portland. And they won 67 games. They had 5 Hall of Famers. Larry Bird was at the top of his game. Kevin McHale was tearing up people in the post. You had Robert Parrish and Bill Walton, both guys playing center. Yeah, we're talking about a tag team at center. Both guys are Hall of Famers. Then, of course, you had Dennis Johnson. Then you had Danny Ainge, who wasn't that far off being a Hall of Famer when you look at his credentials in terms of winning championships. So, I mean, it was embarrassment of riches, right? And it should have been an absolute demolishing. In the first game, Jordan scored 49 points. We're like, whoa, that's pretty good. 49 points. But, I mean, they lost by, I think it was around 10 points. But, they're thinking, well, he put up 49 points, it's pretty much over. And then in the next game, as I said, think about it. You're going up against one of the greatest teams of all time with 5 Hall of Famers. They only lost 1 game at home all season long. He scored 49 points in game 1. You probably think he's probably at most going to get 25 to 30 the next game. Try doubling that, more than doubling that. And yes, they still lost that game. But it was complete BS because at the end of the game, they were down by 2. Jordan's dribbling the ball up the court. He gets fouled shooting a 3 by McHale. And the rule back then was if you're fouled shooting a 3 and you miss the shot, you only get 2 foul shots, even though it's a 3-point attempt. So Jordan makes both. If that rule was, the right rule, which should be, you get 3 shots from when you're fouled shooting a 3-pointer, Jordan more than likely ices the 3rd foul shot because he did make the first 2. He ices it. They win, and they put as many in 2 games. He would have averaged over 50 a game because, of course, it doesn't go to the overtimes. But he would have averaged over 50 a game, and he would have got the same amount of wins or the same amount of losses as at home as what the Celtics endured for the entire regular season against everybody. And they're the 8th seed with 30 wins. That's how good he played. That's unbelievable. So that's the defining game for Jordan's career because I think that not only raises a standard of expectations amongst fans as to how good this guy could be, but with him himself, he probably felt like, he was so good that Larry Bird, as I said, I'm sure you've heard this quote, but it probably wasn't that much of an exaggeration. Larry Bird was probably just in awe of what he saw, and Larry Bird was one of the greatest players of all time. I still have him as my greatest small forward of all time. I am not alone in that. And this is at his peak, when he was about to win his 3rd straight regular season MVP. He said that it looked like it was God disguised as Michael Jordan out there. And it looked like obviously it wasn't God, but he was playing on a completely different level. Absolutely, changed put Jordan on a completely different trajectory, which he did live up to. Now, as for Kobe Bryant, what his defining game was, I got Game 7 against Portland in 2000. And once again, apply some context. Throughout Shaq's career, I pointed this out. When he's gone down in the playoffs, he's gone down really hard. I don't have the number in front of me, but I did count it up last time. But when he was eliminated in the playoffs prior to the year 2000, he was something like 1 win and 23 losses. Give or take 2 or 3 losses, or maybe 25, might be 21, I can't remember. 1 win and 23 losses, though, in series that he lost. He was swept in every single series with the exception of the 97 series against the Jazz. And the only reason that wasn't a sweep was because Karl Malone was like 1 of 23 or something in Game 3. He responded with 40 or so the next game. But the point that I'm making is Shaq had a history of falling flat on his face. And we very nearly saw it in 2000. The Lakers were up 3-1. Shaq had a very dominant first game, but then Portland, with Scottie Pippen, Rasheed Wallace, Steve Smith, Damon Stoudemire, Brian Grant, Vita Sabonis, Bonzi Wells, very, very talented team. They keyed in on Shaq. And even though the Lakers won 2 games in Portland, because of course the Blazers won game 2, but the Lakers won the next 2. Portland won the next 2 to force a 7th game. Shaq once again was being completely handcuffed in that game until midway through the 4th quarter when Brian Shaw and Robert Horry started hitting threes. But the player that actually kept them in the game until that happened was Kobe Bryant. And I tossed up between this game and Game 4 against the Pacers, simply because, and I went with this game though, because Game 4, even if they had lost Game 4, the series would be tied at 2. Had they had lost this game, they'd even make the finals. And Kobe delivered one of the great Game 7 performances in NBA history. So I went with that. Next question. could the Kevin Durant and Steph Curry Warriors or Duncan Spurs have won in the 90s? Yeah, they could, especially Duncan's team. The 99 Spurs did win in the 90s. If we really want to play semantics. I get what you mean though, because up to the 98 lockout, even though there was a 99 season, it kind of felt like it was a different decade. The 2003, 2005 Spurs, I think, could have easily won in the 90s, especially in the 2 years that Jordan, well, he wasn't retired for 2 years, but he was definitely affected for 2 years. One season he came back in and he played 17 games, and that was after 18 months of not playing. Also the 2014 Spurs. So I don't think the 2007 Spurs were that good of a team. I think they just got lucky. Obviously, it sounds, a bit bitter for me to say that, but whenever you have like a Steve Nash incident and Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw getting suspended for Game 5, obviously that made a huge impact in that series. And then, the number one seeded Mavericks were knocked off in the first round, and that, opened it up for the Utah Jazz with Deron Williams and Carlos Boozer. They were an okay team, but definitely not worthy of being a championship contender. And then, of course, they made the finals and they just swept LeBron and the Cavs. It wasn't even close. So I don't think that team would have won in the 90s. Maybe if they went up against the 94 Rockets, because I don't really rate the 94 Rockets. I rate the 95 Rockets, though, with Clyde Drexler. That was a very good team. Robert Horry had emerged as well, and Sam Cassell was playing good basketball. So you had, some depth, as well as two excellent players, excellent star players in Drexler, and of course Hakeem Olajuwon was just tearing everyone up. As for the Durant and Curry Warriors, this is why I was so upset, or not upset, but disappointed in the lack of competition last year in the playoffs. I don't know. I can't judge them accurately. And if they go through and they beat the Rockets emphatically, then yeah, I'd say they could have won a couple of years in the 90s. But based off what I saw in last year's playoffs, the only team that really slugged it out with them, or looked like they were willing to slug it out with them and play a defensive game, was the San Antonio Spurs, and they were up by 15 or so points. Everyone knows this story. They were up by 15 or so points in Game 1 in Oracle before Zaza does one of the dirtiest plays in NBA history. And Kawhi Leonard was out for the rest of the series, and really all of this season as well. So I'm not sure exactly how good they are. I want to see you can only be validated by how good your competition is. And when teams are just getting completely overmatched, it's difficult to. I mean, you can say Cleveland was a pretty good team, but Cleveland was suckered into playing the Warriors style. LeBron was burning out in the fourth quarter, and he wasn't playing any defense whatsoever. Had the Cavs played like they did the previous NBA Finals, especially in the last 3 games, then I'd say, yeah, that would have validated them. But they had such a terrible game plan. It's like they wanted to give the Warriors the title. It's like they made excuses even before they even arrived in the championship round. LeBron saying, the Warriors, they give me a headache to even think about it. And, he posted up great stats, obviously a triple-double and all that garbage, right? But at the same time, he didn't play very well. And the only people that say he played well are people that didn't actually watch the games, because he got destroyed in the fourth quarter. It was hard to watch. He did show up in Game 5. I will give him that. And of course, Kyrie Irving showed up in Game 4. But the first 3 games, there was just they couldn't overcome what the hole they had put themselves in the first 3 games. So I would say yes, the Duncan Spurs could have definitely, because they were an inside-out team, not too dissimilar to the Rockets were actually. That would have been a great series. That would have been a real fun series. And maybe there was, if you put, say, the 2003 Spurs up against the 98 Bulls, I mean, they barely beat the Jazz, and I think, the Jazz were worthy of being a championship team. I remember saying this a while ago, that when they did a 20-year reunion for the Jazz, it felt like a reunion of a championship team. They should have won a championship team. But the 2003 Spurs, I think, were just as good, if not marginally better than the Utah Jazz were in 98. And the Bulls barely got over the line there. So there's a couple of opportunities for them to win the title had they played in the 90s. Next question is, if Jordan was 0 from 6 or 3 and 3 in the NBA Finals, would he still be the GOAT? I don't know. I mean, some of these hypotheticals. I know what you're getting at with this, by the way. It's trying to, like, what kind of a question is that though? Like, okay, if LeBron only played half of his career, would he be considered the greatest of all time? You know, what if we separate Kareem's career as well? So only the Lou Alcindor, from when he was Lou Alcindor and also when he was Kareem, we separate it. You can't do that. You cannot do that. Jordan is 6 for 6. He has 6 championships. We can't just try to take half of his accolades away and say, well, is he still the GOAT? And you know what? The fact that this is a question shows how good Jordan really is, or was. Because anybody else, right? If you said that, well, if Magic Johnson only had 2 titles, is he still the GOAT? If you said that in the 80s, people would laugh at you. Of course he's not. The fact that that's still even a question, like, hey, if Jordan only had 3 rings instead of 6, is he still the GOAT? And if people would still probably present a reasonable argument for him still being the greatest of all time, that tells you everything you need to know about his greatness. And I'm getting really sick of the championships used against Jordan now. Like championships are a dirty word when talking about greatest players of all time. It's a team sport. And if people are going to talk about the great comeback, and it was a great comeback, that the LeBron James-led Cavaliers, Kyrie Irving had big games in that series too, let's not forget him. But LeBron did lead them to a comeback in 3-1. Guess what? He led them back 3-1 from being down 3-1 against the Warriors, right? LeBron James fans will point that out till they're blue in the face, as they should. But is that not a team accomplishment as well? So why is it then when Jordan goes 6 from 6 that it's, well, that's a team accomplishment? Same thing. It's the same thing. If one's a team accomplishment, then the other one's a team accomplishment. It's just, I don't want to sound like I'm getting angry at this, but it's if LeBron James fans want him to be the greatest of all time, you cannot lower the bar. The bar has to be raised. From when you're talking about the greats, if you want the game to be improved, the bar has to be continually raised. Bill Russell to Wilt Chamberlain to Kareem to Magic to Larry Bird to Jordan, they all elevated the game of basketball. And then Kobe Bryant couldn't live up to Jordan's expectations. He tried. He had a hell of a career, but nobody outside of Laker fans will tell you that Kobe Bryant was a better player than Michael Jordan, because he just did not reach that standard. But now LeBron James fans, they are trying to lower that standard. They're trying to lower that bar. Oh, the 6 for 6, that doesn't mean anything. My goodness. I was about to say something else there. But it means everything. For a player to win 6 finals MVPs and go 6 from 6 in the finals, and this is not against weak competition. It's going up against Magic. It's going up against MVP runner-up Clyde Drexler. It's going up against the MVP of the 93 season in Charles Barkley. All 3 of them are Dream Teamers as well, by the way. All 3 of them first ballot Hall of Famers. And then it was going up against Gary Payton and Sean Kemp, one of the more iconic teams in NBA history in the 90s, right? Yes, maybe not the star power of the Utah Jazz or the first repeat, but let's not forget that team won 60-something games in 94 before being bounced in the first round by Denver of all teams. So they were on the cusp for quite a while. They pushed, I'm trying to think, Phoenix, sorry. They've pushed Phoenix to a 7th and deciding game in the conference finals in 93. So they were not a bad team. Let's not dismiss the Sonics, even though they were probably the weakest team that the Bulls had played in the finals. They were not a bad team. They won 64 games that year as well. And then, of course, you got John Stockton and Karl Malone, and I cannot praise them any higher than I have in the past. These two were not just two of the greatest players at their position, but they were the two of the greatest players in their skill sets. Karl Malone is the second all-time in terms of scoring in NBA history. John Stockton has assist records that will not be touched for a long period of time in NBA history as well. Unless you've got guys playing until they're in, their 20th season or 25 seasons. That's how far of a gap ahead of the field he is in terms of passing the ball. So you have one of the greatest scorers of all time and one of the greatest passers of all time. And they played off each other beautifully. As I said before, any other circumstance, they probably win 2 titles back to back. The Utah Jazz. In fact, I think if we're talking about the 90s, I think if the Utah Jazz of 97 and 98 went up against the Houston Rockets of the 94 and 95, with the addition of Byron Russell and the continued involvement of Karl Malone's offensive game, I think they're a better team than the 94 and 95 Rockets. I truly believe that. I know I'll get a boatload of questions from Rockets fans about that, and I'm prepared for it, because I truly believe that. But the question is, or what I was getting at, is that was not weak competition. You look at the Hall of Famers he went through to go through that. And the only argument you could say is, well, to discredit those players, is they never won titles. Well, okay, they didn't win titles. Why didn't they win titles? Because Jordan kept them from winning titles. I'm not going to give, like a lot of people say, well, look at the teams LeBron has lost to in the finals. Yeah, he lost to them. I'm not going to give him credit for losing to teams in the finals. I'm going to give Jordan credit for beating teams in the finals. Anyway, we got a couple of Game 4s coming up. Obviously, the Cavs, I've already predicted the Cavs will win Game 4. And I think the Rockets will bounce back. I think we'll see them make those minor adjustments that they need to do, even though they're kind of major adjustments. But to the naked eye, they look like they're minor adjustments. And I think I hope we get a long series in both situations. I'd like to see, obviously, the Celtics play with a lot more poise than what they did in Game 3. That was hard to watch. And, of course, the same can be said for the Rockets, too. I wasn't expecting them to get blown out by 40 points. Although a lot of that was garbage time in the fourth quarter, it was still that game stopped being a contest, after a couple of minutes. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoy the Game 4s coming up, and there will be a podcast after the Warriors and Rockets Game 4 once again. So thanks for joining us. Enjoy the games and take care.